They didn't carry rifles. They didn't launch attacks. Yet, they were warriors in their own right. Trapped in the chaos of war, surrounded by death and destruction, 77 women became an unbreakable beacon of hope. These were the angels of Bataan and Corregidor, the forgotten heroes of World War II. When the war broke out, the Philippines was a paradise assignment for American military nurses, an opportunity for adventure, duty, and service. But that paradise turned into a nightmare when the Japanese attacked in December 1941. Suddenly, these women were no longer just nurses. They became wartime medics, treating the endless tide of wounded soldiers in makeshift jungle hospitals. 2 hospitals deep in the Bataan jungle, 18 open-air wards, each holding hundreds of men. The nurses worked tirelessly, tending to injuries, disease, and malnutrition. Every day, they made the impossible choice, who to save and who to let go. One nurse later recalled, "There were moments when all we had to offer was a gentle touch and a whispered prayer." April 9, 1942, the fall of Bataan. The nurses were rushed to Corregidor, the last American stronghold in the Philippines. They could hear the bombs falling, the enemy getting closer. Some had a chance to escape, but 66 nurses chose to stay. When Corregidor fell on May 6, they were taken prisoner, the largest group of American women captured during the war. July 1942. The nurses were transported to the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, a POW city, home to 6,000 captives. There, the angels of Bataan became something more than just prisoners, they became lifelines. Inside the camp, they established a hospital, fighting outbreaks of disease with nothing but sheer will and ingenuity. They stitched wounds with makeshift sutures, battled malaria and dysentery with dwindling supplies, and rationed what little food they had. The weight loss in the camps was staggering. On average, each prisoner lost 32% of their body weight. But these women refused to break. They weren't waiting to be saved, they were fighting to survive. February 1945. American forces finally reached the Santo Tomas camp. Liberation had come. The nurses, after nearly 3 years in captivity, were finally free. Yet, despite their heroism, their sacrifices, their unwavering courage, they received little recognition. The war had moved on, and history nearly forgot them. It wasn't until decades later that their story began to surface. In 2001, Chief Nurse Maud Davison, who led these women with strength and discipline, was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just doing their jobs. But their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering spirit turned them into legends. If you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories of wartime resilience. And remember, history is written by the brave. Santo Tomas internment camp. Once a prestigious university, now a prison where thousands clung to life. 6,000 people trapped in hunger, disease, and fear. And among them, 77 brave women who refused to surrender to despair. These nurses weren't just battling infections and starvation. The Japanese guards were watching their every move. Every bandage, every last bit of medicine was rationed, controlled. And yet, they persevered. They set up Santa Catalina Hospital, a beacon of hope within the prison walls, and continued saving lives against all odds. With no antibiotics, no proper painkillers, they had to improvise. They used handmade bandages, relied on herbal remedies, and pushed beyond their limits to keep their patients alive. But in this living nightmare, hunger was the deadliest enemy. Daily rations barely kept a child alive, let alone an adult. The average prisoner lost nearly 30% of their body weight. Some could no longer even stand. But the nurses never gave up. They whispered words of encouragement, shared whatever food they could, and held on to hope when no one else could. And perhaps the hardest part was watching people die. Every single day. Not from bullets. Not from battle. But from starvation, disease, and neglect. The nurses could only do so much, yet they refused to stop fighting. But the worst was yet to come. For nearly 3 years, the angels of Bataan and Corregidor endured the unthinkable. Torture, starvation, disease, yet they never stopped. Every wound treated, every fever soothed, every child comforted was a silent act of defiance. But in early 1945, change was in the air. The Americans were coming. For months, they had heard rumors, whispers that General Douglas MacArthur was making his way back to the Philippines. Liberation was close, but so was danger. The Japanese, sensing their impending defeat, became ruthless. Food rations were cut even further. Beatings became frequent. And there was something even more terrifying. The nurses noticed something strange. The guards were destroying records. Why? Then it hit them. The Japanese were erasing their tracks. If they were truly losing the war, what would they do to the prisoners? They had seen it before. Massacres. Executions. Entire camps wiped out before American troops could arrive. And now, fear gripped them like never before. But then, on February 3, 1945, it happened. The Americans had arrived. The Japanese, caught off guard, scrambled to resist, but they were outgunned. The battle for Santo Tomas had begun. The angels of Bataan and Corregidor had survived the horrors of captivity. But now, their lives hung by a thread. Would they make it out alive? The rescue had begun, but it was far from over. American forces, led by the 1st Cavalry Division, had stormed the gates, but the Japanese were prepared to fight to the death. The nurses, weak from starvation but running on sheer determination, did what they had always done: they helped. Even as bullets flew overhead, they worked to calm the terrified prisoners, tend to the wounded, and keep the children safe. The Japanese, knowing they were losing ground, became desperate. They retreated to the main building, taking prisoners hostage, including the nurses. Tension filled the air. If the Americans moved in too fast, the Japanese might execute everyone inside. Then, suddenly, a gunshot. A single, sharp crack through the air. The American snipers had taken their shot. In an instant, the U.S. forces rushed in, overwhelming the last of the Japanese defenders. And just like that, it was over. The nurses, some too weak to even stand, burst into tears. For 3 long years, they had endured starvation, disease, and the constant fear of death. Now, they were finally free. "You're safe now," he whispered. And for the first time in 1,124 days, they finally believed it. But the story wasn't over yet. Because now, after years of hell, these women had to return home. Would they be welcomed as heroes? Or would they be forgotten by the country they had suffered so much for? They were finally free. But as the waves carried them away from the horrors of Santo Tomas, a new fear settled deep in their hearts. What would happen next? They had spent over 3 years in captivity, surviving on nothing but scraps of food, sheer willpower, and each other. Now, they were heading home. The angels of Bataan and Corregidor had returned. But what greeted them wasn't what they expected. What was it like? Did the Japanese mistreat you? Were you ever afraid? The nurses, exhausted and emotionally drained, could barely answer. They weren't looking for fame. They weren't looking for medals. They just wanted to heal. Narrator, somber tone. For most of them, there were no grand parades. No public celebrations. No heroes welcome. Their sacrifice was overshadowed by the victories of the Pacific War. Most Americans didn't even know their story. They had been prisoners, caretakers, survivors, but now they felt like ghosts in their own country. Even the Army Nurse Corps, which had praised their resilience, failed to recognize them as official prisoners of war. It wasn't until 2001, more than 50 years later, that Chief Nurse Maud Davison was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. A recognition that had come far too late. But despite it all, despite the starvation, the fear, the abandonment, they had never stopped being nurses. Never stopped saving lives. Never stopped fighting. And that's why, even if the world forgot their names, history never will.